On October 2nd, 2022, we flew to Portland, Maine. We picked up our rental cars and drove to our oceanfront Airbnb in Kennebunk. After settling in a bit, we took a short drive to Kennebunk Port's Dock Square. Kennebunk and Kennebunk Port are side-by-side villages that reside along the Kennebunk River. Historically, Kennebunk Port was a shipbuilding and fishing village. Nowadays, it is mostly known as a summer vacation town and a seaside tourist destination. Kennebunk Port is also known for Walker's Point, which is the summer estate of the Bush family. After enjoying the early morning views from our house, we headed toward Portland to do some lighthouse bagging. The Portland Headlight is located in Fort Williams Park, south of downtown Portland. Construction of the lighthouse began in 1787 under the direction of George Washington. It was completed in 1791 and is the oldest lighthouse in Maine. Also in Portland is the Portland Breakwater Light. It is also known as the Bug Light due to its tiny size. From Bug Light Park and other of Portland's lighthouses, Spring Point Ledge Lighthouse can be seen in the distance. Portland is the largest city in Maine. It was the state of Maine's original capital after Maine had seceded from Massachusetts in 1820. The capital was later moved to Augusta in 1832. Make sure I don't hit anything.
You're good. You're doing good.
The Great Fire of 1866 caused about 1,800 buildings to be burned to the ground. After the fire, most buildings were rebuilt with brick with a Victorian architectural appearance. Portland is considered America's craft beer capital since it is the city with the most craft breweries per capita. After having lunch and walking around a bit, we drove to the town of Freeport to visit the LL Bean flagship store. It is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. On our second full day in Maine, we drove up the mid-coast, passing through Bath and Wiscasset.
Oh, right there, the Red Sea.
Usually has a really long line when they're open. Boothbay Harbor is the boating capital of Maine's mid-coast. Boothbay is a very popular summer destination, and there are a number of boat tour companies located here. There are many small stores and galleries along the waterfront. The Boothbay Footbridge was originally built in 1901 and reconstructed in the 1970s. The bridge actually has a swing span that is supposed to allow larger vessels to pass through it, but it is currently not functional. The Pemaquid Point Lighthouse was commissioned by John Quincy Adams in 1827. It was rebuilt in 1835 due to poor workmanship. Evidently, salt water instead of fresh water was used in the mortar mix, which caused the original lighthouse to rapidly crumble. The lighthouse was featured in the special Maine quarter that was issued by the U.S. Mint in 2003. On October 5th, we drove from Maine to New Hampshire. After entering New Hampshire, we drove to the White Mountain National Forest. The Kankanagus Highway is one of the most scenic highways in New Hampshire and is considered one of the best fall foliage viewing areas in the world for leaf peeping. The 35-mile highway, which runs from Conway to Lincoln, was originally opened in 1959, but wasn't paved until 1964. One of the stops we made on our drive was at the Albany Covered Bridge. It was first built in 1858, but has been reconstructed and renovated multiple times over the years.
Calendars, yeah.
In Franconia Notch State Park, we visited the Flume Gorge.
You're doing good. Just watch out for
To see the actual gorge, we went on a hike on the Flume Trail, which is a 2-mile-long loop.
Happy hiking!
The Flume Covered Bridge was built in 1871 and has been restored many times. The Flume Gorge is located at the base of Mount Liberty and was discovered in 1808. The walls of the gorge are granite and were covered by glaciers during the Ice Age. At the top of the gorge is Avalanche Falls, which has a 45-foot drop. The Sentinel Pine Bridge was built in 1939 and was named after a century-old pine tree that fell nearby in 1938. From the Flume Trail, there are views of Mount Liberty, which some say looks like George Washington lying in state. After leaving the Flume Gorge, we drove east on the Kankamegas Highway again to North Conway, which is where our Airbnb was located. Along the way, we made a few stops to take in the colorful fall foliage alongside the highway. On October 6, we drove through Crawford Notch State Park to the Marshfield Base Station in order to take a trip on the Mount Washington Cog Railway. When the cog train was first proposed in 1858, naysayers said that the builder was crazy and might as well build a railway to the moon. The railway started operating in 1869.
Okay, good morning and welcome to the Mount Washington Cog Railway. My name is Terry.
Due to the steepness of the tracks, a rack and pinion system is used to keep the train from sliding back down. At one point, the train climbs at a 37% grade, which makes it the second steepest railway track in the world. Unlike most trains where the train cars are pulled, the cog train locomotive pushes a single car up the track. The original locomotives had wood-fired steam engines. Currently, 2 have coal-fired steam engines and 7 have biodiesel engines. At 6,288 feet, Mount Washington has the highest peak in the northeastern United States. It is one of the mountains named after presidents and other famous figures in the presidential range of the White Mountains. The summit is infamous for having some of the worst and unpredictable weather of any mountain in the world. In 1934, recorded wind speeds measured at 231 miles per hour is the highest measured wind speed on Earth that wasn't associated with a tornado or hurricane. The temperature at the summit of Mount Washington is usually around 30 degrees lower than the base, and there's usually poor visibility. But we were lucky that when we visited, the temperature was in the relatively warm 50s, and it was one of the rare clear days on the summit. Besides the cog train, there are a few other ways to reach the top of Mount Washington. Cars can take the Mount Washington Auto Road. It is supposed to be a scary drive, and those who make it to the top receive a "This Car Climbed Mount Washington" bumper sticker. Hiking is also an option, although over 161 people have died hiking to the peak of Mount Washington and other mountains in the presidential range. At the start of our drive to Vermont, we took the Bear Notch Road to reach the Kennebunk Highway. After driving alongside the Connecticut River along the New Hampshire-Vermont border, we arrived at Quetchi Gorge. It is jokingly referred to as Vermont's Little Grand Canyon. Since a nearby apple orchard was not open during weekdays, we decided to visit a cheese and maple farm nearby instead. Along the way to the farm, we passed through the Tapsville Covered Bridge. At the Sugarbush Farm outside of Woodstock, we were able to sample some cheese and maple syrup. We were also able to see the sugar house where sap from maple trees are turned into syrup in the spring. On our way to our Airbnb just outside of Killington, we passed through the picturesque town of Woodstock. On October 8th, we drove up Vermont's spine on Route 100 along the eastern edge of the Green Mountains up into the Mad River Valley. We made a quick stop in the village of Warren to see the Warren-covered bridge that crosses the Mad River and the Warren store. In Waterbury, we stopped at the Ben & Jerry's factory. Unfortunately, we were not able to obtain tickets for a factory tour. But we were able to pay our respects at the Flavor Graveyard. Among the many tombstones for the dearly depinted, we saw Tennessee Mud, Holy Cannoli, Economic Crunch, This Is Nuts, and What a Cluster. made a stop at Church Street in Burlington, but it was very crowded due to family weekend at the University of Vermont. The Shelburne Museum, located south of Burlington, is a very unique outdoor museum. It was founded in 1947 by Electra Webb, whose husband's great-grandfather was Cornelius Vanderbilt. The museum consists of about 39 buildings. Many of the buildings are historic and were relocated to the museum grounds. This covered bridge was originally built in 1845 in Cambridge, Vermont. In 1949, it was dismantled piece by piece and put back together at the museum. The Hat and Fragrance Gallery building has one of the largest collections of quilts in the country. It also contains a large collection of rugs and hat boxes. The general store was originally built as a post office for the town of Shelburne in 1840 and moved to the museum in 1952. The apothecary shop was built at the museum in 1959 and made to resemble an apothecary from the late 1800s. The lighthouse was originally built in 1871 on Lake Champlain and moved here in 1952. The side paddle wheel steamboat Ticonderoga was built in 1906 and operated on Lake Champlain until 1953. In 1955, it was relocated to the museum. The interior was restored to portray what it looked like on board in the 1920s. In 1953, passenger service was discontinued to the railroad station near the center of Shelburne. 6 years later, it was moved to the Shelburne Museum. The circus building contains a miniature three-ring circus consisting of over 3,500 hand-carved pieces. The building also contains a 500-feet circus parade consisting of over 4,000 scale figures. had a very long drive from Vermont to Boston. We decided to make a detour and were going to stop in Salem. Unfortunately, it was like a zoo. After driving around for a while looking for a place to park, we finally gave up and headed to our Airbnb in Boston. We had lunch and then returned the rental cars. In the evening, some of us took the T to Boston's North End. We were going to buy cannolis from both Modern Pastry and Mike's Pastry for a taste test, but the line at Modern was too long, so we just bought cannolis and other pastries from Mike's. It was quite an adventure taking the T back to the Airbnb. We encountered a lot of issues with the trains not arriving when and where we were expecting them. On our last full day in New England, we went on a walk on the Freedom Trail. Our first stop was at Boston Common, which is the oldest city park in the United States. The Massachusetts State House was designed by Charles Bulfinch and was originally completed in 1798.
Of course, they always just
The route of the Freedom Trail is clearly marked. All you have to do is follow the red brick road. The Granary Burying Ground was established in 1660 and is named after a grain storage facility that was once located nearby. The obelisk in the center marks the grave of Benjamin Franklin's parents. John Hancock, Paul Revere, and Samuel Adams are also buried at this cemetery. Although it isn't part of the Freedom Trail, we passed by the Omni Parker House, which is where the Boston cream pie was first created in 1856. The Old South Meeting Hall is where Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty organized the Boston Tea Party. In front of the Old State House, there is a ring that marks the site of the Boston Massacre that occurred in 1770. The lion and unicorn statues on the roof are symbols of the British monarchy and are replicas since the originals were burned in 1776. Faneuil Hall is a marketplace and meeting hall. It is a site where American colonists had protests and heard speeches encouraging independence. The construction of Quincy Market was originally completed in 1826. Inside is a large food court and some shops. The Rose Kennedy Greenway is a park that was created as part of the Big Dig, which rerouted the Central Artery Highway going through Boston. Construction work for the Big Dig took place between 1991 and 2006. The Paul Revere House was built in 1680. The Revere family owned it between 1770 and 1800. The Paul Revere Mall contains a statue of Paul Revere, which was placed here in 1940. Our final stop on the Freedom Trail was at the Old North Church. This is where 2 lanterns were hung on April 18, 1775, to signal that British troops were heading to Lexington and Concord by sea. We took the T from the north end to Kenmore Square. From there, we walked by Fenway Park and then headed back to our Airbnb. On the morning of October 11th, we headed to the airport and then flew back to Nashville.
When fall comes to New England, the sun slants in so fine, and the air is so clear you can almost hear the grapes grow on the vine. The nights are sharp with starlight, and the days are cool and clean. And in the blue sky overhead, the northern geese fly south instead, and leaves our Irish setter when fall comes to New England. When fall comes to New England, and the wind blows off the sea, swallows fly in a perfect sky, and the world was meant to be. When the acorns line the walkways, then winter can't be far. From yellow leaves a blue jay calls, grandmothers walk out in their shawls, and chipmunks run the old stone walls. When fall comes to New England, frost is on the pumpkin, the squash is off the vine, and winter warnings race across the sky. The squirrels are on to something, and they're working overtime. The foxes blink and stare, and so do I. 'cause when fall comes to New England, oh, I can't turn away from fading light on flying wings and late goodbyes a robin sings, and then another thousand things when fall comes to New England, when fall comes to